Good morning and welcome. You are joining more than 200 other registrants for the Stewardship Symposium sponsored by Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary of Lenore-Rhine University. This is our first all-virtual symposium, and I'm just so pleased that so many could join us from a geographical distance. My name is Jim Johnson, and I serve Lutheran Seminary as staff musician, and it's also my privilege to chair the planning team for the annual Stewardship Symposium. We are pleased to present today's topic of living into a culture of abundance with the Reverend Mike Ward. I want to acknowledge our funding sources today. We've received grants from the Lilly Foundation, from the LTSS Region 9 Council on Stewardship Education, and from Thrivent Financial. These funding sources have enabled us to present this symposium without a registration fee, and we're very grateful for the generosity. As we begin today, I would like to call on seminarian Amanda Spangler to offer an opening prayer. Amanda?
Good morning. Let us pray. Holy God, we thank you for this space that you have provided for us today as we gather to learn and pray together and to disperse and bring words of hope to our communities. We praise you for the assembled wisdom in this space, especially Mike Ward and all of our panelists, and for the technological gifts that make our time together possible. Open now our hearts and focus our minds so that we may grow as stewards who cultivate a culture of generosity and a mindset of abundance. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I'd like to introduce to you now the Dean and Rector of Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary at Lenore-Rhine University, Dr. Mary Hinkle-Shore.
And I thought as I do that, I reflected a little bit on abundance and what that means for us right here and right now. First, it means that students are still coming to seminary. We have people every day calling to ask, like, I didn't think this was my calling, but it's seeming like I need to explore it. And our enrollment coordinator, the Reverend Jennifer Shimoda, loves those conversations, and people find a place here to prepare for callings in ministry. Our students have gifts for ministry that include curiosity and heart. They love God and they want that love to show up every day in what they do. They preach and teach at the intersection of the world's need and the abundance of God's grace. And, you know, while higher education and seminary education especially maybe spends a lot of time in talking, our students press us to walk the walk, even as we do all that talk. Part of our abundance is our faculty as well. Many of you are clergy, and you know that since last March, everything is different about the way you embody your calling. And that's true for our faculty as well. And they have retooled on the fly. We're teaching all of our classes online this semester. We, like you, were worried about not taking the virus seriously enough versus overreacting versus the dangers of infection over against the dangers of isolation. All of that is true at the seminary, and in the midst of it, the faculty are finding ways. We're all finding ways to worship, to teach and learn, to offer pastoral care. It's still seminary. And I'm thankful for the abundance of our partners. We get by with a lot of help from our friends. Many of you are among those friends. We have churches, synods, individuals, folks who keep in touch with us, who find a place for our ministry in their budgets, and who continue to keep us in prayer. Thank you for all of that, and thank God for all of that. What I'm also doing this morning is introducing our keynote speaker. The Reverend Mike Ward is a certified fundraising executive and an ELCA pastor. For 12 years, he served as the Vice President of Advancement for Novus Way. If you are in the Southeast, it's likely that your congregation has had a direct relationship with one of Novus Way's camps, and you are the beneficiary of Mike Ward's work there. He raised over $13 million for the camps, in addition to managing the annual fund and planned giving during the years he was there. Now he's a partner in GSB, where he works still with camps, congregations, nonprofits of various kinds in their fundraising work, strategic planning, and board development. You have, I think, his book, Abundance, Creating a Culture of Generosity. He'll be speaking on that topic with us this morning. He has a passion to teach people like us how to move from scarcity to abundance in the way we think about what we have and what God has to offer us and call us into. And this passion extends to helping us not just adapt our own thinking, but actually be change agents for the cultures of the places we work and live and pray. Please welcome Reverend Mike Ward.
Stu, honey, you're not going to wear that same sweatshirt again today, are you?
Why not? It's quarantine. What difference does it make anyway?
We are 11 months into the pandemic. Don't you think it is time to start changing your clothes more than once a week?
I guess so. But don't start telling me I can't wear shorts for my Zoom meetings.
I can live with that. As long as you stay sitting. Speaking of Zoom meetings, are you ready for our church small group meeting?
Ugh. Another Zoom meeting?
It's time to get over it. It starts in 10 minutes, just enough time to put on a clean shirt. I am sure there are plenty in your closet.
Check.
Oh, I almost forgot. Could you please remember to put the offering envelope into the mail?
Why bother? It's not like we can even go.
What do you mean? I feel like there is more going on at church for us than ever before.
Come on. Name one thing.
Well, there is the Bible study.
On Zoom.
There's coffee and donut hour.
On Zoom. And I have to bring my own donut.
Our small group.
Where is that again? Oh yes. On Zoom.
And Sunday morning worship. Yes, that's on Zoom too. But how wonderful that we can see our friends and catch up. It just does my soul good to reconnect. I've even made some new friends.
I suppose you are right. There are some good people there. And the other week when we talked about Moses and the burning bush and taking his shoes off, I never thought of the pile of shoes by our front door when the kids have friends over. It is like our home is holy ground too.
Now how about getting that check in the mail?
Consider it done. Wait a minute. This check is way more than usual.
Yes, I was feeling generous.
But now? With so much change, and you can't make plans for next week let alone next month.
It is time to be generous, now more than ever. You're working from home.
Yeah.
I've adapted. We're both still getting paid what we were before. If we can't be generous now, then when?
I guess you're right. We can afford it and the church sure needs it these days.
Now get to the post office. And don't forget to change your shirt.
As you wish.
We have 2 panel discussions. Our first panel will be some younger pastors that engage stewardship work early in their career. And then later we'll have some more seasoned pastors. I hope that's the appropriate way to share that. I do hope that you'll use the chat box for questions. Some questions will interrupt me and we'll do right away. Others will save for later. I also hope you'll be greeting friends. I know I've got several friends that have joined from across the country. We've got a lot of the country represented today. So use the chat box. Occasionally, I'll even ask you some questions there and ask for some responses. So kind of pay attention for that if you would. What I'm going to do now is tell you a couple of stories. This first story, I want you to pretend that we're in worship on a Sunday morning and it's the time of the offering. I guess it could be a temple talk too, but I like to position this at the time of the offering. It could be a written story in a newsletter or a video story you push out. But for right now, pretend we're in worship. It's the time of the offering. And I'm up front to tell you a story. And by the way, this 30 years ago was a true story. It's still a true story. It's just about 30 years old because it was me then. I lost a camper this summer. This summer, on your behalf, I worked at Camp Lutherock, which is something I never thought I would do, because for years I successfully avoided your recruitment drive to be a camper. I had plenty of excuses and you accepted them all. But finally, in a moment of weakness, I let you sign me up and somehow I got on the bus. This year, after my first year of college, I worked on summer staff, but as I said, I lost a camper. Now don't worry, after about 30 minutes, I found him. And I was paying attention enough to notice that he was gone, but he had taken the wrong turn on a trail and I had lost my responsibility and I missed him. But it was in that moment that we connected. We connected on his fear of being lost, and more than that, we connected on his feeling that he was important enough to be found. He taught me about forgiveness. He taught me that even when I messed up as a leader, that God could make good things happen from it. He felt like most people wouldn't come look for him. And it turned out we had a beautiful relationship this summer and he saw God in the midst of it, as did I. So thank you for making me go to camp. Thanks for your financial support that sent me. Thank you for your mission support to the Synod that supports those camps. And if you're interested, go ahead and sign your child up or your grandchild up for a similar experience. And don't worry, they don't lose them anymore. Real life story. Another story for you. And Neil, I don't know if the PowerPoint is up, but if we could move to the third slide, if it is. I'm not seeing it, but I may just have a different view. Next story, this could very well be a bulletin announcement, or it could be, it could be spoken as well. And this too is a true story. The month I serve on Altar Guild is the most spiritually renewing month of my year. This is a phrase I never thought I would say. However, it is serving on Altar Guild that my prayer life is at its best. Because I set the table on Friday afternoons when nobody's in the church. It's so quiet, and I feel like I can have a conversation with God in that space that I just don't find in the chaos of normal life. I'm willing even to serve a second month each year because this time is so special for me. If you're interested in joining me in serving in this way so your prayer life can grow and you can have a more spiritually enriching experience, I invite you to contact me, but do so quickly because there's only one space still available on our Altar Guild team. And finally, a third story. If I'm completely honest, online worship leaves a little something to be desired. However, it's shown me what is truly important in my life. We used to come to worship about every other Sunday, and now I find myself tuning in every single week. I long to be back together again, focusing on God's love during the prelude, hearing the good news, even in the bleakness of winter and all that is going on in our world. Online worship keeps me going. It has been through the pandemic that I realized how important worship is for my life. I'd like to thank our pastor and musicians for the excellence that they provide to our worship that allows me to surround myself in the good news in times that are. If you haven't discovered how important online worship is, I invite you to join me. Three stories that could very well be told at the time of the offering, could be told in bulletin announcements, could be told in newsletter articles. Yes, I realize they're a little long, but they tell a story that needs to be shared. We can move to the next slide. But here's how we often tell our story. The Altar Guild needs you. Here's our responsibilities. You get 1 month and it's not a burden and you don't even need any experience. Contact Sarah for more information. We turn what is really a spiritual opportunity into just another task. It's another thing to do, another thing to occupy people's time, another piece of work that needs to happen. And we fail to promote the benefits and the outcome and what God's up to in the entire activity. And we promote in ways that reinforce scarcity. You know, if I'm a visitor to this congregation and I read this, it makes me feel as if worship is so important, why isn't anybody signing up to do it? Why is the scarcity feeling on the side of having the volunteers engaged? Why isn't the scarcity on the side of there's very few opportunities left, you better hurry soon in order to participate, which is the way I told the story. The next slide. I've seen this announcement in worship since I was a child. This announcement appears in the bulletin. It's a piece of information. And it's a valuable piece of information because if Maundy Thursday worship is going to happen, we should know what time it is, okay? We're going to assume it's on Thursday this year. But all we tell people is what we are offering and when it is happening. We don't tell people the underlying reason why they need to participate or what need within them can be fulfilled by their participation. We don't give them a reason to come unless they've come before. This message, the one that's right here on the screen now, Maundy Thursday worship at 7 p.m. The audience is limited. The audience are the people who have come before. The audience isn't your visitors. The audience isn't even your members who haven't experienced Maundy Thursday worship in their life before because they don't know what they're missing or why it is that they would come. And so this announcement for me leaves something to be desired. I imagine the church that promotes this announcement experiences less and less attendance at their Maundy Thursday services each year. Instead, why don't we find the story of the person who discovered Maundy Thursday later in life, who discovered that the entire Lenten season makes more sense because now they attend Maundy Thursday, that Holy Week has deeper meaning when they experience the Last Supper through the eyes of the disciples. Tell the outcome story. The person to tell this story is probably the person who married into Maundy Thursday worship life. They've married a spouse who has grown up attending, and now they get dragged along and find out what is it in them that helps them to experience Maundy Thursday better. All right, and now if we can move to the last slide. A typical announcement for how it is we would sign up kids for camp. I don't find it, if we can get the next slide, I don't know if, anyway, imagine, if you will, a slide that says a typical announcement for coming to worship or for coming to camp. Here are the dates we're going to go. Here's how we're going to get there. Here's how you can sign up. All information, no inspiration. Even in a story of losing a camper, we can find some inspiration that God was up to something in the encounter, that God had something in store in life and both parties grew. And I have a reason for the storytelling versus the simple information sharing. And it is because that even in the information sharing, we're reinforcing scarcity too often, and we're missing audiences in that information. We think too often that the camp announcement to sign up for camp is simply for the parents of campers and the children coming to camp. But if it's getting real estate in your bulletin or in your newsletter, it has the capacity to be read by everyone. Everyone being your donors, if we're looking at this through a stewardship lens. And so it becomes a donor communication. And do I want my donors, my members, my visitors to worship to only see an announcement that they don't feel like it's for them and it's simply information that doesn't relate to them? Or do I want them to engage a story that through the things that we're about here, God is doing something? That even if you're not the parent of a camper-aged child, you should feel good about what God is up to in the lives of the children. That your offering support is sending kids to something that is making a faith impact in their lives. And that's what you find here. See, what I want the donors to see is not that we don't have enough people to serve on Altar Guild, but what I want them to see is that through serving on Altar Guild, people are finding a spiritual connection through the activities of this church. What I want them to see in the opportunity for online worship is I want them to see that there are opportunities in this space to grow in faith that they may not yet be aware of. I want them to see that God is doing things, not just that we have things happening. We need to get beyond the idea that we just need to be busy, and that's what the kingdom of God is about. But what we need to be about is that God is doing things even through, I won't call it a mundane activity of Altar Guild, but even in the work of the church, God is up to something in those things. And by the way, recruiting people for Altar Guild will be far greater if we tell them the outcome and not just that we're trying to suck a little bit more time out of their lives. So the storytelling that we do, what God is up to, we often will refer to those as outcome stories. We refer to those as impact stories. And who should tell them? I think they're best told by the people that are being impacted. I will tell you though, that story, I'm getting feedback. I think we got some people not muted. The story I told you about Altar Guild is a true story. It's not my story, but I have to be the one to tell it because the person whose story it is too shy to share that in public. Okay. And so I tell on her behalf. So we have these stories. They need to be told. They need to be told all the time. And these stories set the stage throughout the year. We talk about year-round stewardship. It's not asking for money year-round. It's planting the seed year-round so that when we are ready to ask for money, people are ready to give because the ministry that they're being asked to support is so vital and so vibrant. So that's what year-round stewardship is. It's these tellings of impact stories. Neil, if we can, we have a poll that I would like to share and ask all of you a question about how well it is you do in telling these stories. So Neil, can we get that poll up?
Okay. You don't want my answer. Neil, I think Neil's asleep. I think Neil went out for a beer. What's wrong, Neil? Yelling at Neil. He turned off his mic. He's upset. Come on. Christian actions for Christian folks. Let's go, buddy.
So we'll get the poll up here in just a minute and get that going for you. So
He's upset.
can we mute, please? Here's our first poll.
Okay.
If you've not done polling before, it's on your screen. You should be able to click on your answer and hit submit, and it'll come in. If you don't see the poll question on your screen, if you'll go to polling and you can get it there.
I think we're real good at it, don't you? Or you're not listening. I have to take you off the list of people attending. You don't want to steal it.
And then I assume I could do this out of Neil's office, right?
Yep.
Or will I lose anything if I unplug?
No, you just take the. I'll hook you up.
Oh, okay.
I'll bring this.
Hey, can I do this from here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I triple checked everything yesterday and
Okay.
I don't know why the sound isn't working.
All right, and can you put the poll results up? All right. So I've moved, so and here are the poll results for us. About 20% of you think you're really good about telling outcome and impact stories. That's fantastic. About 56% of you struggle to tell these stories, but do so occasionally. And then 24% of you don't tell them at all. So from my experience, one of the biggest challenges in our congregations is to be telling these stories. If you need a place to look for these, a place for examples beyond those that I just shared with you, I encourage you to look. Novus Way is the camping ministry here in Region 9 in ELCA circles. Novus Way, in my opinion, is the example for how to tell these stories. And they have what's called the Link newsletter. So if you go on their website, and actually, Neil, if we can go back to the PowerPoint presentation, I think I've got the web address in one of my slides. And so their Link newsletter, which you can find on their website, it's nothing but outcome stories. And let's advance. Let's go back to, actually, we'll give me the control and anyway, it's at novusway.org and you can find it there. I'm going to back up some slides though. About telling the stories. A word about that. It's a culture change to get to those kinds of stories. One of my favorite ways to start to acquire these stories is to start every council meeting off with asking the question, what have you seen God up to since last month? Like, what's God up to in your life? What's God up to in your life because of your interactions in the life of the congregation? How do we tell those stories? The easy stories are probably the ones that the youth do. Like they're really good about telling them. I think that's why mission trips got so popular in our churches over the last several years. It's because when the kids come back, they tell these stories. And so we love to hear these stories. And I think that's part of the reason mission trips are so popular. But we need to find the stories in the everyday of our ministry, in the altar guild, in all of what we're doing. We need to find those stories in our small group, in our Sunday school classes, in the hospital visit, in those sorts of activities. We need to get those stories. Actually, Neil, we're not on. Can we get the PowerPoint slide? Thank you. So Jesus told a lot of stories, and because of Jesus's life, many stories happen and take place. The feeding of the 5,000 is a story I go back to all the time. You'll find throughout the course of this day, I'm really a lot about abundance and abundance thinking, and there's probably no better story of abundance than the feeding of the 5,000. The man in the wilderness isn't bad either, but the feeding of the 5,000, and I think it relates to the way in which we live out so much in our congregational life, because Jesus is gathered with the 5,000 plus. It's getting late in the day, and people start getting hungry, and the finance committee says to Jesus, we better send them all away because they're getting hungry and we don't have enough to feed them. And Jesus then looks at the finance committee and says, no, you don't understand. Have them sit down. There's plenty here. We simply need to share it. And we read that after giving thanks, all ate and were satisfied. And I just love that word satisfied, because we live in a culture that thinks we need to be full. Just look at plate portion sizes when you go out to eat, what we serve. We feel like people need to be full, and we fail to learn to just live to be satisfied. And I actually, if we got to John 10 and talking about abundant life, I think the key to abundant life is feeling satisfied and not needing to be full. And we learn that there were leftovers. But I called them the finance committee, but Jesus called them the disciples. Saw the world from the scarcity mentality when the reality was there was abundance there. And too often we do that. As this pandemic was first getting started back in April, well, it certainly started before then, but in April, my congregation got a grant from ELCA World Hunger. And it was really cute the way the email to all of us came out, assuming scarcity, because the email said, great news, we've gotten a grant from World Hunger, but now we have to match it. Or, we have to actually, I think we had to give $750 and they'd give us $500. But don't worry, we've got a couple months to raise the $750. Well, 52 minutes after this email landed in my inbox, we had exceeded the $750 goal. And by the time it was all said and done, I believe it was somewhere in the $4,000 or $5,000 range that we had raised. We assumed a bit of scarcity when in reality there was plenty there, and all we had to do was ask for it and it would be provided. And so we need to work through this scarcity mindset. Probably, well, I'll tell that in just a second. We tend to stifle the story. The things that we do in stewardship way too often hear things that cause them to think there's not much around. All right. My least favorite, or I think it's my least favorite. Hey folks, good news. We kept the budget flat this year. Now, won't you make a pledge and be generous to this congregation? Which, what that tells me as a donor is there's nothing new going on here. We have no plans for the future. It doesn't really matter, right? Or we'll tell people, hey, go ahead and make your pledges now, and then we'll figure out what we'll do next year. From a biblical perspective, I suppose that might be a faithful way to approach things. But the problem in the reality is that's not how donors work. Donors want to know what money will be used for, what the impact of that money is going to have, why it is you need any new money. You need to have figured out what you're going to do and then invite people to give to that. And then just so often we just assume scarcity. We even start out things with, now I know everybody's been hurt by the pandemic. That's not a true statement. Assuming scarcity for everybody in your community isn't an appropriate way. Now, at the same time, do we need to alert people or allow that some people have been hurt by the pandemic? Certainly we do, but don't assume scarcity on other people's behalf. I've gotten fussed at before by people who we assumed were in a poor position to give, and they felt like we were leaving them out. And so don't assume scarcity for people. Don't say no for people. And for goodness sakes, please don't tell people how far behind on the budget you are. You've gotten the letter, right? It sounds something like, oh my gosh, we don't have any money. You know, we haven't been able to give the staff raises in years. We're probably gonna have to cut the pastor to 3/4 time. Things are terrible. Won't you make an extra gift to support this vital ministry? What a funny way to end that letter. By the way, if you work with me, I have a rule that you're not allowed to send that letter out. That letter is not permitted to be sent until we get to a point where we can say, hey folks, it's been an interesting year of ministry. And I love this, what we're doing so much that I'm going to make an extra gift to help us close the $20,000 gap we have at the end of the year. And not only have I done that, but the entire finance committee has joined me in making a gift. And towards the $20,000 gap we need to fill, we already have $4,000. We invite you to join us to make this vital ministry stronger. Okay. That's part of the story that we need to share, and not just tell people how bad it is. Like, if all you do is send that year-end letter or that letter that says how bad things are going, if you get a 10 to 15% response rate on that, you're doing great. And that's about all the better you can assume you'll get when it's just the bad news, when it's just a scarcity story. But when it's a story of need and that there are leaders leading and inviting others to give, you'll be amazed at what can happen and what will come in. All right. So, and then sometimes we don't tell the whole story. Something that happens over and over again in our congregations is the fact that costs go up each year. And sometimes generous donors pass away or move away. And when that happens, they tend to take their giving with them. And so, but we don't ever really tell much of that part of the story. Neil, if we can cue up the other video with Stu here in just a second. We don't accommodate for that. There was a year where my wife and I grew our giving fairly significantly. And then midway through the year, we began to hear these stories that we were behind budget and we didn't have enough. And I was thinking to myself, well, why did I bother increase my giving? Because apparently nobody else did, because we're still behind budget. But what I came to find out as we kind of explored this a little bit, and I got drafted to help with the stewardship efforts, we learned that Ruth had died, and Ruth was really generous, and her $30,000 a year in giving was no longer there. But nobody had told us that part of our growth needed to replace a donor's gifts. We just felt then that there just wasn't enough there. And so we need to make sure we tell the whole story. And I'm going to call now on my brother, Stu. We recorded him at church this past Sunday. And we're going to see what Stu has to say about this topic here. So Neil, let's run that.
Well, if it isn't my good friend, Bill. Bill, ding.
Good morning, Stu. How are you today?
Not bad. Thanks. Say, I heard that you got suckered into being the chairperson for the properties committee. How's that going for you?
Well, it is something. Right now I am supposed to find someone to hire to plow snow and spread ice melt in the winter. You wouldn't believe how much ice melt has gone up in price.
It does seem like everything gets more expensive.
Every single year.
You would think they could keep the prices the same for a church.
Not a chance. I guess that's why the pastor thinks she should get a raise every year.
And the wider church too. Sheesh. Every year, a little bit more for everybody else.
But I guess I sort of expect some kind of raise at work too. So why should the people who work at the church be different?
Yeah. I guess this seems fair. I bet things cost more at their house just like mine. You should see our grocery bill. I caramba.
When you think about it, the church is an interesting thing, depending on people to give away their hard-earned money for ministry.
Yeah, but look at what is going on. We started the new lunchtime feeding ministry. The pastor's new Zoom Bible study is actually interesting.
Yep. It's all worth supporting. But I was also thinking about some of the good members we have lost. It was such a shock when Gymnasium died.
Yeah, that was a tough one. He was such a great athlete.
And what about Chris?
Chris?
Chris P. Bacon.
Oh, that's so sad. I hadn't heard about him. How did he die?
High cholesterol.
And in November we lost Stu Flame.
She loved her desserts. They all really loved this church, didn't they? And they loved to support it. They all give so much.
It sounds like we've got some work to do.
What do you mean?
Together we have to make sure there are the financial resources for ministry. Not just inflation, but repletion.
Repletion? What's that?
Repletion. It's like inflation, when prices go up. Repletion when we replace the gifts of people who have died.
Stu, my good friend, I think you might be onto something there.
We'd better get into worship. I don't want to have to sit in the front.
All right. So hopefully from hearing from Stu, we can recognize that we have a whole story to tell just to get to even the inflation and repletion piece. And then we have the story of what new do we want to do? And you're welcome to continue to enjoy the puns through the chat box. Those are, fine and good for conversation amongst one another. So all of that then gets into our case development. And what, so I, for a dozen years, I was the vice president of advancement at what is now Novus Way Ministries, the camps here in Region 9. Responsible for the fundraising and the marketing and a few other things. And when I first got hired there, I got sent to Indiana to the Lilly School of Philanthropy. What is now the Lilly School of Philanthropy. And I took a course called Principles and Techniques of Fundraising. And it was a 5-day course, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. each day. And in that course, we spent the entire first day talking about case development. So 20% of this course on principles and techniques of fundraising was spent on case development. Because what we learned is that if the case that you put in front of people isn't strong enough, support will not be very strong. That everything in the fundraising effort begins with the case development. Now, I say begins with, that's when we're getting ready to ask for more money. Where it really does begin, though, is in the telling of those impact stories, those outcome stories, in order that people, trust the organization and know that the organization is making an impact on folks. And so that's the groundwork. And then when we get ready to ask, we need to build the case. How much more money do you need? And what will you then do with it? Those are the questions we ask as we develop the case. What difference is this money going to make in the world? What difference, if I give you $1, what difference does it make for the kingdom of God, at least in our context here in the church? The National Park Service and humanitarian organizations and animal welfare organizations, they have their case as well. But our case is one in which hopefully the kingdom of God will expand because of the work we do. So how much money do we need and what will we do with it? Case development isn't saying, pledge your money to us and then we'll figure out what to do next. Case development is stating, if we have an extra $300 a week next year, we're going to invest $100 a week in making up for lost giving and covering the cost of living increases that we need to do. And then we have the other $200 a week to expand our digital footprint or to, renovate a bathroom or to launch a new youth and family ministry program. I'm not here to tell you what your case ought to be. The more compelling your case, the more money you can raise. Okay. Especially the first year that you really clearly articulate a case and develop that and place that in front of people. It's also important to present your case as in a way in which it sounds achievable. $2,000 a week doesn't sound like nearly as much money as $100,000, but they're about the same, okay? So we want to give people the understanding of what we need. And then that also actually, that's kind of later afternoon session, because I'm sorry, I just lost my thought. Anyway, case development. How much more money do you need? What will you do with it? We'll talk a little bit more about that this afternoon and how we motivate a donor necessarily to give that. And that case development relates to the impact we're currently having. And those year-round stories that we've been telling and doing. So we've talked pretty good about outcome stories. And by the way, for outcome stories, I pointed you to Novus Way. You can look at all of the outdoor ministries, I think, across our country. There's others here in South Carolina. I think I saw somebody was representing the Ohio camps. And so just know that for me, I look very clearly to our outdoor ministries for their abilities, because they're just so good at telling those outcome stories. So I pointed you to one. There are plenty out there. You can pick your favorites. I'm not here to pick favorites today, just to let you know that I highlight outdoor ministries because I think they do a phenomenal job across generations of telling outcomes. You know, not just the kids, but the parents, the grandparents, the adults who come to retreats, the councils who go to leadership opportunities. So I think I've shared with you a good bit about outcome stories. But then as we get closer to the stewardship appeal, and certainly year round too, there are another type of story, and those are generosity stories. And why I love generosity stories so much is because we live in a world that doesn't like to talk about money, all right? And if we need to argue about that, I suppose we can, but we live in a world that we don't like to talk about money. And in some congregations, I've heard of rostered leaders, pastors, deacons, interviewing for positions and being told you're not allowed to talk about money, okay? Which stifles the telling of generosity stories. If we were gathered in person today, I probably would have broken you up into small groups and said, who taught you generosity and how did they teach you? And probably somewhere between 85 and 90% of you would answer that your parents or grandparents or another close family member taught you that. And that's pretty traditional. But what happens if our parents or grandparents weren't really as generous as maybe they could have been? And we'll get into some statistics on generosity in a later session. But what happens if we're learning generosity from people who aren't generous? Well, then we don't necessarily learn how to be generous. Or what if our view of the world doesn't open us up to seeing generosity in another way? And by the way, I should probably just put it out on the table that I don't think the concept of tithing is very helpful. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the afternoon session. Too few people do it, and too many people are too far away from a tithe that they can't get there. But I want everybody to be on a generosity journey. And I feel like the telling of generosity stories help us to get there. And they help people learn how to be generous, and they spark ways in which people decide to become generous. There's a church that I've had the privilege to work with in the Carolinas that I learned of a story that some non-members approached the pastor and said, hey, we got these stimulus checks. This was back in May, when stimulus checks came out. We got these stimulus checks and we don't need them. And so we'd like to give them to the church because we assume that you can do something really good with them. So here's our stimulus checks. And so then the pastor told other people in the church that story, told it anonymously, didn't tell people who the folks were necessarily, but said, we have two people that aren't members here that gave me their stimulus checks, and here's what we're going to do with those, which encouraged other people to give off of their stimulus checks or to give their entire stimulus checks up. There's a concept in fundraising that generosity begets generosity, but that can't happen if we're not telling these generosity stories. Okay. There's also a concept that nobody wants to be the only generous person to a cause. And as we tell generosity stories, we give people permission to join others rather than to tell people what they ought to do, right? We need to create what I call a join us culture or a join me culture, rather than a hey, you oughta culture, all right? And so that's why I like the telling of generosity stories. I think they should be told year round, and they should especially be told close to the stewardship time. We had a person, I threw out some ideas this year in one of the programs we offer, and I made the statement that I said, you know, certainly pre-pandemic, not quite as much today when I'm stuck in my house all day, but pre-pandemic, I could easily lose $20 a week and not even know where I lost it. You know, I used to be through airports, you know, a couple times a week, and you know, you can't get from one concourse to the other without $20 coming out of your wallet, right? And I said, you know, what if instead of losing that $20, I discovered it and I gave that as additional gift to my church? We had a congregation where a council president picked up on that and said, you know what, I lose $20 a day, if not a week. I'll do that. Do you know that over the course of a year, and told that to the congregation, and several people joined him. Over the course of a year, that a single person giving $20 a week, it's $1,000. Now, if I had asked him to give $1,000, probably would have said, no, that sounds like too much. But discovering the way to be generous can spark other people and how it is they can become generous. And that will lead to even more generosity. One concept that I realize, or two concepts I want to share. By the way, start thinking of questions. We're going to have a couple of minutes for questions before we transition. So if you have questions, anything I didn't develop fully enough, start putting those in the chat box, and those will get shared with me here shortly. But a couple of things. Back to the case for gifts. I highly encourage every congregation, like I know you have budgets or spending plans or whatever it is we call them these days. And those are important. But at the same time, I hope that all of your congregations, as you develop your case, will develop opportunities for people to fund that are even beyond the budget. All right. I encourage congregations to have at least 10% more need than they develop and express in their budget, because otherwise, I could see this being at least 50% more and not be out of whack by any means. And the reason I want to do that is because too often we've made the budget the goal, as if the kingdom of God will come into being if we simply balance our budget this year. Okay, there is more to be done than we currently have in our budgets, and so we need to be prepared to tell people what that is. All right. Particularly as we get to the end of the year, if it looks like we might exceed our budget. One of the best ways to stimulate more giving at the end of the year is to then tell people what you'll do after revenues and expenses meet. I think I'll talk more about that this afternoon as well. But have 10% more. And I don't want you to do this so you start securing restricted gifts, like that people get more excited about what's next instead of what's currently in your operating plan. But I want you to have it in case somebody gets a windfall gift that they want to share with you. And so make sure that you have opportunities for people to invest in as that happens. And don't get caught in the position where somebody comes to the office and says, hey, I've got $10,000 that I'd like to deploy for ministry. What would you do with it? Make sure you've got an answer for that. And so that's a key thing. And then one more thing I forgot to mention earlier on the gathering of outcome stories. In addition to starting council meetings with a question of how have you seen God at work in the life of this congregation or in your life over the last month? One of the most effective ways, and the pandemic kind of taught us this, we can just Zoom one-on-one with a person, hit the record button, and have this conversation of, hey, what's God up to in your life right now? And so in some ways, the pandemic has made that easier for us to get those. My congregation did that, where the pastor would interview somebody each week. I think she did it for about 4 or 5 weeks in a row. And for me, that was the highlight of worship that week, was seeing that reconnection, but then hearing what it was God was up to in that person's life, and as that connected to the life of the congregation. So very much, that's another way to get some of those outcome stories. With youth, I would never let them leave a retreat until they gave me some outcome stories as to what the event meant, so that I had those to tell, and then I began telling those immediately. But they also have a shelf life. You can push those out throughout the year. Hey, remember the trip to camp we did? Here's one more story as you reflect on that. So that's good. And when we tell these outcome stories, when we share these generosity stories, when we invite people to give to a case, what we will get to is people feeling like they're investing in a significant ministry rather than somehow making a financial transaction with your church. Okay. I don't want people to feel like they're just involved in a financial transaction with you. I want people to feel like that gift they're making is impacting the kingdom of God and making a difference in the world. And that because of their gift, they are part of that story. Okay. It's not a financial transaction. It's about an investment. It's about joining. It's about becoming part of the story through the gift of a financial gift. And remember, the starting point for the story is the case for gifts, and it gets reinforced over and over throughout the year, through these outcome stories, through these generosity stories and the like. So I think I'm not seeing any questions on my screen. Either everybody left the meeting or I was just way too basic in my presentation and there just wasn't anything of significance. So any kind of, questions related primarily to setting the stage, not what does Stu do next or anything like that, but any questions on where we are to this point? Then Neil, I think we've got a second poll that we can go ahead and put up, and we'll see what that brings us, if anything. So there's a poll live for you. If you'll fill that out, we can see what's there. It seemed that it's working. Okay. I mean, it's on my screen, so I assumed it's working. Give you another 3 seconds on the poll. 3, 2, 1. Close the poll. See what we got. All right. So 2% of you think you're awesome at all this and don't have much to change. That's fantastic. Keep it up. 68% feel need improvement on storytelling. 80% on the improving shares of generosity story. That's the hard one. I mean, that doesn't surprise me that that's the winner in this, because we are a culture that doesn't talk about money. I'll come back to a couple things on that. 62% need to fully develop the case for gifts. Oh, I haven't talked much about this. 60% of you believe that you'll be more fulfilled as a leader if you develop these outcome and generosity stories. What a true statement that is. I think you were very right. So if we go back to the opening stories, the story of Maundy Thursday worship is at 7 o'clock on Thursday this year. That's a real easy announcement to write. We don't have to call anybody. We don't really have to look it up, because we just know that. We can type it up. 15 seconds later, we're done, and we can move on to the next task. But the story of virtual worship being impactful and making a difference in my life, that's harder to gather because we actually have to call somebody or find a way to talk about and discover that story, right? So when you start doing this, just realize, you're not going to transition everything in your bulletin all of a sudden to be all about outcomes. I encourage people to start with, one a month. Sometimes I've encouraged, could you at least find an outcome story, 4 times a year on the 5th Sunday of the month when you have those. And then get to the point where you're telling them every week, and they're getting embedded throughout. It is a great way to go. But I believe that work will lead to far less burnout amongst our leaders in churches. Even the altar guild person feeling like they're alone because nobody will sign up for altar guild when they put out the message that it's there, but nobody signed up. When they remember that it's spiritually fulfilling, then they're less burned out in the work because they remember their spiritual fulfillment. But then as leaders, we remember that, yes, we're busy, but in the midst of that busyness, God's doing something. And so I do believe that you'll be far more fulfilled in that. So that's great. So y'all are doing great now on the questions. They're coming in. First question I'm seeing, is it impactful even if you were telling someone else's story rather than your own? I believe so. I believe there are times and places where anonymous stories can work. And oftentimes when you first start telling generosity stories, most of those are going to end up being anonymous because people just aren't comfortable with that until you start to break down that barrier. And by the way, this is a lot of what we talk about, the culture change that needs to happen within congregations. And that culture change doesn't happen quickly. And so starting anonymous and then moving into some personal witness, I think is very good. And even the outcome stories, sometimes those will be anonymous. Sometimes they'll be told on behalf of someone else. But then I encourage you to move towards getting people to actually tell their own, because I think ultimately somebody telling their own story is more impactful. But certainly if they're too shy to tell it, that's going to be a tough sell and other things. So telling somebody else's story is fine. Telling stories anonymously are fine. And a lot of times generosity stories are even better told anonymously. So, okay, so anonymity in a small congregation. I hear you on that. At the same time, I think it would be a faith development practice to start to be able to tell, those stories. And hopefully in that smaller atmosphere, you can become a bit more intimate and a bit more vulnerable. But it probably, especially on generosity stories, it's probably a lot harder to be anonymous. That's a good question. My hope would be that we could create that atmosphere for the vulnerability, for the intimacy to happen. And I know so sometimes that can happen by sharing examples from others. To prime the pump, get an outcome story that you're hearing from a peer or another congregation. Let your leaders digest that story, and then maybe they can start to tell that kind of a story. I know we may or may not have time for it later. There's a congregation in South Carolina dealing with the issue of should the pastors know what people give. They used my book as a study tool to open up those conversations and got to a deeper place on conversation. So sometimes using a book as a basis can lead people to overcome any fear that they might have and set the stage for those kinds of stories. So there's a question up about how do you tell outcome stories when everything seems to go to operating expenses or even overhead? Thank you so much, whoever asked this question, because it's something we should talk about. So I don't believe that there is a lot of operating expense in a church, okay? And I want us to move to deleting that phrase and even more so, delete the word overhead from your vocabulary, because Sunday morning worship is not an operating expense. It does have the expenses of staff, of music, of heating and air conditioning, and pews and carpeting and bathrooms and water and electricity and all those things. Those aren't operating expenses. That's worship. And so as you tell the story of worship, then we have that. If anybody dares ever tell me that pastoral care is overhead, there's very few ways you make me angry, but that's a way to do it. Because as people lose a loved one, as people experience job loss, as people experience fear of what's going on in the world, they need pastoral care, and that's not overhead. That's the core of our mission. And we need to be able to tell the core of our mission as a story. And so there really is very little overhead in a church. There's very little operating expense in a church. There's a whole lot of ministry in the church. And what I want to have happen is these outcome stories tell all of that as what we do. Critical first step in changing culture from scarcity to abundance. Man, just one thing. So like there's a lot. I'm gonna get to 3 tomorrow, or not tomorrow, later today. The 3 keys are leadership, the way in which you operate your stewardship, and then having a strategic plan. And I'll get into that a little bit this afternoon. Part of it too might be controlling your message, making sure that everybody's on the same page with this, because too often I discover that a well-meaning finance committee person or a well-meaning other leader in the congregation may accidentally destroy abundance thinking with their messaging. And so part of it is controlling the message and auditing the message. So hopefully we get more into that later. And if not, I wrote a book on that. It's called Abundance. We'll get to that later, maybe. So who sends the request for pledges letter, the pastor or a congregational leader? It really can be either one, and we'll get into that this afternoon. Then what else? Telling stories in digital worship, the best I've personally seen is where that Zoom interview happened. It's recorded, edited down, and then shared in a digital service. I actually think it's easier to tell these stories in a digital service, and we have more ability to keep them to 3 minutes than we do when they're live. Sometimes they can get a little out of control when they're live. I do believe if they're inspiring, it's okay to be longer, but at the same time, we can edit down. So I encourage any of you that know of good examples, put those up in the chat, share. Let's let this be a little bit of time where the group helps each other. So digital worship doesn't cost much, so people don't need to give. It's not about digital worship. It's about the work of the church. So impact stories on what digital worship is having in somebody's life need to be happening. I don't know very many churches where it is really that much cheaper. But the focus, here's another place to where if people are saying digital worship doesn't cost much, so we don't have to give, that's a great reason why we would have 10% more ministry that we want to fund than the budget needs. Because if we save money, then we can put money into something else that is vital and significant beyond just that digital worship piece. I personally am not sure that digital worship doesn't cost that much, because the pastor's cost is the same. And actually, maybe if it doesn't cost that much, maybe you ought to invest more in it. And maybe that first Stew video that we showed as we were getting going can talk about that a little bit as well. So yeah, I'm going to kind of let that go there. And as I look at the clock, I am a minute away from when we were going to give you your first break. And so I think I'm going to do that. Yeah, why don't we do that? Why don't we come back at, let's come back at 11:25, or no, I'm sorry. We'll come back at 11:30. And at 11:30, we're going to have a panel discussion. So you're going to get to hear from some of your peers on some of what we're talking about, and then pointing more towards some of the other pieces that we'll get to after lunch today. So, and I'm sorry, I forgot we do have multiple time zones. We'll be coming back in 15 minutes from right now. So whatever time zone you're in, just add 15 minutes to right now, and then we'll see you there. And so thanks for hanging out with us this morning. I'm excited about these panel discussions. You're going to hear from some people that are doing some really good stuff stewardship wise. And we'll pick up the conversation from there. Keep the questions coming. We have somebody monitoring the questions, and those will get to me so that we work at those before we dismiss later this afternoon. So thanks a lot. Take a quick break, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes.